Before we start though, let's just talk about what what we're trying to do with the channel and like what everyone's goals is for themselves and also the channel itself. Does anyone want to start?
I have no idea what we're doing. I'm just drinking a beer.
So I can start. This channel is basically made to be like an educational, informative, fun way to kind of understand what social issues are and how people on the political spectrum see them, how multiple people who might not be too inclined to identify with a political ideology also see them based on their identities. So we're going to be spending a lot of time discussing different issues, different topics that has to do with like social issues that are going on now and what's currently happening. So this is kind of like a current event kind of thing, plus a better understanding of how uh, the world of activism and social issues actually functions through the lens of different people and different groups. And so yeah, I think for me, the reason why I kind of wanted to start this was because I wanted more people to get an easier way of understanding how these social issues work and like to be able to explain to other people any questions that they might have had or like things that I see in debates that might need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think I had a let me see. I'm not muted. Okay. Um yeah, I was kind of going off that last point. I think my main purpose with this channel or main reason for being here is really to tackle to kind of zoom out from things and look at discourse from a more critical perspective and kind of just really address sort of and kind of like question more critically like some of the assumptions we often make in certain debate discourse spaces and kind of like tackle a lot of issues and things which people kind of things that kind of go unquestioned in especially in like intellectual spaces and in political spaces. And so we want to, of course, address these things which might be considered sometimes controversial topics, or maybe they're not necessarily controversial, but they're things that kind of go unquestioned. We kind of want to talk about these things and unpack them. I think that's a big, actually, that's kind of a, I think that's a word which captures the connotation well, unpacking things. Um, also, this would also ideally in the future, maybe not in these first few episodes, kind of provide a space for people with very uh, conflicting worldviews, or why am I saying conflict that way? Conflicting worldviews to kind of come together and have sort of a consolidated space where they can um, unpack things in a sort of in a more formal manner, I think. Um, yeah, and because obviously a lot of times in real life, in more colloquial circumstances, especially you can say online or stuff, it's kind of hard to find a space like this. And a lot of times when people try to do more formal spaces for this, it ends up being very one-sided. And so this allows us to also facilitate connections among across certain boundaries, which sometimes are set in real life, certain de facto boundaries. So yeah, I think really, yeah. So in a nutshell, it comes down to two things. One thing is unpacking a lot of the assumptions we make about these intellectual spaces, and two, being able to facilitate difficult conversations.
John? Um, I guess what to further piggyback off of what Mico and Jonas were saying, that I really hope that this I guess we're doing it's a podcast, right? I hope this can spark dialogue between people that see themselves on two different sides of an idea, or maybe even just somewhere in the middle. Um, I really don't think that there's a way to kind of like quench like a lot of like the discord in the world, specifically in America right now, without dialogue between people. And so I think that's mostly why I'm here. I just want to open up a space where we can address issues and bring conversation to a place where everyone feels included, but also where everyone can really just lay facts bare, like where we can really just see, well, this is the actuality of the situation, not just like your limited perception of it. So that's most of what I hope this is.
Yeah, I'm Christian. I my name is. I think we all got to talk to each other on Facebook pages talking about things, and sort of the comment sections are a little less substantive. So I think opening up that conversation, even having a place to invite people to challenge what we think, sort of fits the name of moot. Moot could mean like a consensus, but as we add people into our consensus, like how does that change? How can we challenge what is actually a moot opinion amongst different people? And Mico has a PowerPoint about that, I guess.
Yeah, so just like a quick disclaimer about what we might be saying throughout these videos and podcasts. Some of the things that we might be introducing are not technically our perspectives. It's just what we tend to see around the discussions and debates of that center around these topics. So we're gonna try our best to kind of get both of the sides of the argument and try to piece them together for a lot of people to see how different people like work with and play with their kind of beliefs and perspectives. We're not necessarily endorsing any perspectives or any ideologies, but we're trying to let people know like this is exactly like how certain people feel about this issue and how other people might feel in the contra perspective. So yeah.
Or also, another thing too is sometimes you may feel that we might sometimes be poorly explaining a perspective, especially if it's something that we're not super familiar with or a certain ideology. So I mean, if that happens, by all means, like feel free to correct us, really. And I mean, in the future, we are planning to be very open about inviting people on our show. And again, we do want to emphasize, though, that just because we invite someone on our show, that doesn't necessarily mean we endorse their opinion. Rather, we feel like it's something maybe that other people might be able to understand or something.
Mind you, a lot of the stuff we say is based off of stuff we read, stuff we see online, stuff we see in like interactions we see between people in real life. And so yeah, we're just taking a lot of this stuff and putting it together. So it might not be like super linear in terms of like understanding it, but we will have multiple segments of the shows where we'll talk about recurring themes. So there's going to be like different instances where we can address like questions and stuff like that. So yeah. With that, let's start. Our first question that we kind of want to talk about is like, where do political and social stances originate, right? Where it comes from. Does anybody like want to comment on that first?
Oh, I got this because I'm ready. But I'm biracial. That I am half black, half Nepali. So my mom immigrated here when she was 10 years old from Nepal. My dad was born here. My dad is African American and my mom's Nepali. But my dad grew up in ghettos in the hood, the Midwest, very poor. My mom grew up very poor when she immigrated here. They both worked really hard for education and whatnot. So that's informed part of my views on education and on socioeconomic status. I'm also gay, which really informs a lot of my opinions about the LGBTQ community and the role that gay men play in this community, especially as a gay man of color. There's a lot of intersectionality that occurs. So a lot of my political views are largely informed by the experiences of myself or my family. And then as I've gotten more and more involved with people like those you see here in this podcast and others that I've met over the course of my life, I've become more informed of other people's identities and other people's lifestyles or other people's circumstances. And that, along with my own research and education, has led me to be very, I feel, left-leaning. And those are the reasons why.
Right. So like a lot of what John talked about was identities, like the concept of identities, like where we belong, like our social strata and like our niche within the communities. I think a lot of people tend to forget when they're trying to introduce their perspectives is that a lot of people have different frames of thoughts that are based off of their identities and their experiences with their identities and how they grow up. A lot of people might see themselves as like their own personal experiences tend to kind of outweigh like what society tends to think, or they might just not really understand like the micro versus the macro when it comes to some of these issues like race or gender. Some people might think that individuality is more important than like group identities, and that therefore because of this individuality that we're supposed to focus on, there really isn't much like issue outside of it, because everybody like tends to have their own problems and like face their own like challenges, which is why some people don't really understand like where these issues actually like matter in terms of the macro scale, and like how it systemically impacts like people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting concept. I think a lot of them might actually, you're talking about the micro versus macro, might actually relate to people who want to look at things more from an individualistic perspective versus a more communal or collective perspective. Or collectivist, I think, is a better term to use there. And so I guess one thing which is important to consider is because the thing is I don't think I'm trying to personally say any claims on which end needs to be more emphasized in a general sense. I mean, maybe it does depend off of individual situation. But like, I guess one common criticism I've seen of a more communal perspective is kind of like, yeah, I mean, individual perspective. I mean, you can get caught in the trap sometimes of where if you look too much at these general notions and general identities, I mean, it ends up becoming where you make a lot of assumptions about someone just based off of your perception of identity. That's another thing which is important too, is like the idea of how you perceive yourself versus how others perceive you. Because I mean, you can think of however the heck about like who you are and your identities, but if other people don't necessarily see that, that's not, your experience is going to be different than someone who actually is that experience. But at the same time, you know, other people can't necessarily tell you that this is how others are necessarily perceiving, because that's affected by how they perceive you. And so there's always, I think there's always a grain of salt when it needs to be taken with a lot of these statements. And of course, that's especially as, I mean, as someone who's very active in a lot of mixed race groups on Facebook and spaces as well. At least on my campus, I just graduated from a university campus. That comes up a lot, you know. It's like sort of like your cultural identities, especially if you come from multiple cultural identities, versus how others perceive you and how they see you. Yeah, that becomes very important. I mean, like, that's why there's the concept of, you know, like white passingness versus black passingness, because that kind of affects. It's like, okay, well, maybe you come from a certain cultural identity. I mean, because I know, for instance, I know one of my best, not well, wouldn't call him best friend, but one of my really good friends from high school. He's half black, half Korean. Most people see him for him being black because he's very black passing, but at the same time, his African American father left him at a very early age, and so he's actually much closer to his Korean side, and people don't actually realize that. I mean, I know another person at my school, also similar case, but except she's half Japanese, and she's much closer to her Japanese side. I mean, she speaks Japanese fluently. She's visited Japan multiple times, and so that's like an important thing to sometimes consider also with identities is, you know, and there's like those two different axes you need to focus that you can focus on, right? There's more individual perspectives and kind of the intersection of how multiple identities intersect together to form an individual experience, versus you can look at general concepts and say, okay, based off of this identity, I can make some general assumptions about people who generally fall under that identity. And then there's the other, versus that axis, there's the other axis, which is kind of how you perceive yourself versus how others tend to perceive.
Yeah, and me, I typically find, as everyone's background, for me growing up, I had divorced parents, but particularly two very different politically leaning households. So I was sort of incubated in like two different worlds. So I was kind of forced to. I couldn't have an identity that was like, oh yeah, this is like the right way, because when I went to another home, that was suddenly incorrect. So I had this strong premise of questioning what any authority is in any case. So I found a lot of value in this case for me, a sense of individuality. But even as we discussed, like as valuable as identity is, there's also a case of an individual is valuable because you can do so much. You have your own personal experience that is valuable that other people can replicate. As we become more diversified as people, we're less likely to just fall under a single race, as we've even described. But that's also a figment of people's individuality. So, in observing that, it seems like there's a means for individuality to reach that sort of perspective, but there's also a world that we engage with of society that has all of these hang-ups on people's identities. Say that a topic is like all lives matter to sort of mute everything, but that sort of ignores the context that people's identities do have an impact on how they're treated. So it's hard to... There's a difference between what we like to appraise and what actually occurs in reality. So I think especially in dealing with the internet, our internet discourse, and it's a constant joke, like you're not going to change anyone's minds with the internet, but you can just like talk. Like this is us leaving our comment sections and trying to find some more personal way to communicate in an online frame, as opposed to writing something angrily then leaving. And hopefully it can be more, again, we hope that this can include more people, but this is sort of just an introduction as to how we like everything to operate.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, though, context is very important, and I think, so sorry to kind of change gears back to what you were first saying, but context is important in the sense, like, for instance, so I grew up in an extremely white area where basically no one there had any cultural identity, which I came from. My dad's an immigrant from Hungary, came to Canada at first when he was in his 30s, and then came to the United States when he was almost 40 years old. And then my mom, though, on the other hand, she's Korean American. She came here when she was 2 years old from South Korea, moved to what became Koreatown, but back then there were hardly any Koreans there. It was mostly white and black, the community. And then when she was 12 years old, she moved to Orange County in an area which became super Korean. So we kind of joke and say that the Korean community kind of followed her and her family, but she went there when it was an extremely white area. She experienced so much racism, hatred, prejudice, everything you can name it. And certainly that led to a lot of self-hatred when she was younger. But I think as she grew older, she came to accept who she was a lot better. Anyways, I grew up in a very white area as well, but I think my personality, the way I interact was a bit differently. I mean, it's interesting because I mean, when I was younger, I looked a little more Asian, but I think now I'm kind of in an ambiguous state, I'd say, superposition, you could say, of both identities. But it's interesting. This is when I'm saying how others perceive you is very important, because I was extremely Asian passing there, but then when I moved down to California in high school, suddenly I saw people who grew up in very Asian-dominated communities, and a lot of them just saw me as white, really, because I couldn't really connect with them. And it's interesting because I took that Asianness, I'd say, for granted. And then as a result, growing up in an area like that, I didn't really pursue that as much, especially because my mom is pretty Americanized herself. I mean, I ended up becoming a lot closer to my Hungarian side, but that's just because my dad, was still very close to Josiah, and his entire family still lives there. Meanwhile, my mom's parents and her siblings all moved to the United States with her. Well, one of them was actually born here. My grandma was pregnant when they moved. I think my point is definitely I've become closer to that on less of a more symbolic scale and more of a cultural scale since I moved down here in high school. But it's just interesting. I think, as you were saying, Christian, yeah, it's very important to consider context in these cases. I think sometimes it's very easy for people to make very general statements about identities when in very specific contexts, in certain communities, how your identities interact with that community can be very different. It's important stuff to consider. Yeah.
What's your next slide, Mico?
Oh, did we already address this? Like how identity politics can be helpful or not?
Oh, we didn't address that.
Oh,
yet, no.
Well, I think it's the first episode. We're allowed to be choppy. But as far as
It's gonna be edited anyways, right? So I mean, we.
Oh, it's live, Jonas. We're live.
Oh, we're live now, but in the end, you might see a processed version. I don't know.
So like,
Yeah.
you have like why identity politics can be helpful versus it like having detrimental effects. Personally, I don't actually think that like identity politics are ever a good thing. I do think, however, though, that having labels for certain things that like to describe certain things are very important. I don't think that having like labels diminishes like other aspects of a person. Like Jonas was saying before about how you're perceived versus what you actually identify as. And like I think it's definitely true, but for like me as well, that being like I think I'm perceived more as Black, but culturally that I've grown up more with my mom's side of the family, and so I'd always grown up, like eating curries and observing Nepali holidays and going to temple and doing various things that were more in line with my mother's side of the family. But the way that all my friends perceived me when I moved to California was like as this like, and I've even had them say to me before, like this big scary Black guy, who until they like I opened my mouth, they were like, oh my God. So I think it's just interesting to perceive. I mean, I don't think I'm scary at all.
You're not scared at all. I don't know what they're saying.
I mean,
I'm probably the most approachable of any of us here, to be honest. I mean,
well, I mean, I'm just thinking about, like when I moved to California, I probably was like 5'8" or like 5'9", and I was 11, so I was really tall. So like all my friends were like just were really little. Anyways, that's besides the point. My point being is just that I actually think that identity politics, period, are problematic. But I don't think having like the labels that like people identify with are problematic, because I don't think like issues should be as like watered down to like, oh, this is LGBTQ political like issue, or like a Black person like political issue. I really think that most of these, not to be all lives matter about it, but are really just human rights issues, because we're talking about how to further establish a more equal country for any Americans to come, not just the ones that exist currently. And since any American to follow could be like of any identity, any religion, any gender or sexual identity, that's important that we discuss these as like human rights issues rather than just individual identity concepts.
So this is really interesting, John, that you brought your point up, because like I know you're very leftist from my interactions with you. You're pretty left, right? Like, and this is not a very normal like stance for a left person to take, to say that identity politics might be very problematic. Usually like the left.
Well, in American leftism, yeah, because I know some leftists online from say Germany who also think they have issues with identity politics.
Oh, right, yeah. So I think like to give a little context to our viewers, like what we're talking about right now is usually it's U.S. centric. It's basically like it's basically just politics in the U.S. and we're gonna address like other obviously perspectives from international people. In our later slides, but like this is our entire channel is going to be mainly US centric, just so we can get people to understand what activism and social issues are happening in the US is like. I think this is like a really interesting response from John, since like most US leftists really do think that identity politics is like more or less helpful, just because like the arguments I've heard over and over again is because it creates like a coalition or like a collective form of activism for people to kind of like fight. I guess like an example would be like Black Lives Matter, which is like very prevalent going on right now. That's like kind of a form of identity politics, I guess.
Well, I think a lot of it's also them taking certain older leftist perspectives, like Marxist perspectives, and kind of reframing them in perspective of like modern day understanding of identity, in the sense like you can kind of see things from like you can make sort of analogies, maybe direct analogies or implied analogies between say like proletariat and like some groups that are like oppressed for their identities and sort of are like systematically disadvantaged for identities, and so they kind of make a certain parallel there, I think. And so there's a comparison of sort of certain classes which could be seen, or certain identities which are seen as oppressed or oppressed classes. That's a little bit further left. I'm sure I know there's a lot of people on the left who don't think that way. I'm thinking more in the far left, people who are more supportive also. Marxism and Leninism.
Like an economic centrist perspective as opposed to, because I mean this gets tied in with leftism as far as like democratic politics, was like economics and identity politics aren't like the same thing, despite how much people like to pretend they are. Like you find intersections, that's what intersectionality is about, how race and your economics position can affect how you're treated, but it's not necessarily intrinsic.
When Mico brought up earlier that identity politics are typically seen as a helpful thing to the left and seen as beneficiary, like, and use Black Lives Matter as an example of it. I think that traditionally, and even the idea behind Black Lives Matter is that it's drawing attention to an issue for a group of people who have that issue. Like Black people tend to have a lot of issues with police brutality, but the actual then legislation and reform isn't just for Black people, it's for anyone, because as we've been seeing as of late, even with the protests, anyone of any like, you know, identity can be brutalized and has been brutalized.
Yeah,
so I think, I think that even if you go further back to like, you know, the 1960s, when you look at like the March on Washington and like the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement of that era, that even though it was spearheaded by mostly Black civil rights leaders, there were people of all identities, sexualities, and ethnicities involved, as well as looking at even people who are mixed, like Rosa Parks and Malcolm X. So I think it's just like the left has maybe, I think, a strong issue with like naming things aptly sometimes. I don't think that what they want is identity politics. I think what they more on board with is human rights. Like I've seen so much over the internet the last couple of days that like the fact that Black lives even mattering, the fact that it's a political stance, people are like, how is this politics? And I agree. I don't think that humanitarian issues should be devalued to something as low as politics. I mean, they're humanitarian issues.
I mean, but that's also why it sucks, because the interpretation as to, like, even Black Lives Matter is somehow bad messaging to some people, or they're just not intellectually honest, or they're just bad faith about it, and that's how we end up having all lives matter. And there's a myriads, there's hundreds of analogies as to how bad it is. It's like having your house on fire, and then someone's like, well, what about my house? Like we can do this like all day. So then what's the issue? What's exactly a perception that would make Black Lives Matter so hard to understand as a concept?
Depends. I think there's a lot of reasons why people sometimes they don't like Black Lives Matter. They don't agree with like the stance. I mean, some people just been fed like horrible misinformation by right-wing media and like their spaces. It's very hard for them to actually understand what it is. But of course, you could just argue, why don't you just look it up on your own? But some people, they're just not that involved or care that much about Black lives, apparently. I mean, like, I think a lot of it also is people are just, I mean, I don't want to say jump the gun, but there are certain people out there who probably don't like it because they're just racist. Like, they don't actually care about, like, they have certain preconceptions about Black people, and they make them think, oh, if I say, like, I don't want to say Black Lives Matter because I have these thoughts about Black people, right? And so they're just anti-Black. I mean, but I'm not going to say that's all the cases, because I've talked with enough people that I know that a lot of them really aren't actually thinking that. A lot of them just misunderstand the message completely, as in they think like Black Lives Matter is some super extreme radical movement. And of course, as with any movement, especially a movement which is so universal and something which is so much towards human rights, of course you're going to get people in that group who are going to have ideologies you don't agree with, but like it's not about that. Like, and if honestly, if you look at like major statements made by like Black Lives Matter protesters, it's often completely different from what others' perspectives are on Black Lives Matter. Especially the media, I think, is a big culprit of this, because especially right-wing media, they often do take out certain things completely out of context, or very extreme things which are being said, and certain people interpret that as somehow representing the whole movement. A lot of times, the people just don't want to face certain. They don't want to feel uncomfortable. I mean, they don't want to feel like they feel like a certain sense of like privilege or entitlement. They don't want to challenge, so they don't want to.
But this also fits the frame of, can identity politics be detrimental? Because there's often cited by like more right-wing figures, or not right-wing, but say like, you know, that Republican wing of the party who's like, you know, I'm kind of not down with police being able to kill people all the time. I mean, in like Buffalo, the famous old man who was pushed by the police, Martin Gugino, that was a good example of like, you know, here's this older white man who's been brutalized by police, and he gets called an Antifa sort of actor, and now there isn't the same reaction of, oh, that could happen to me. And there's sort of a perspective of that toxic individualism is that it's like, well, it's not happening to me, and that sort of thing we revolve around of what's not happening to me. Like, how can I control my circumstance? I don't get hurt by the police because I can control that. I can control all these other things. Why should I care? Yeah. Then I think another famous one that's cited is Daniel Shaver, who was a white man who was shot by the police in a hotel room. They thought he was going to pull a gun from his basketball shorts, but he just didn't want his pants to fall down in front of people, and they shot him. Like, would it then be detrimental to say that the frame of police violence and the frame of black people is detrimental? I mean, obviously, I would say that there's a disproportionate amount of violence. But is there a realm of, say, if you're white, police are going to hurt you too? Does the messaging of emphasizing that it's black people take that away from white people feeling like they have something invested in not being killed by the police?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that comes around, and sometimes people use that criticism of quote unquote oppression Olympics as in like, why should we focus on one when it still happens to the other, even if it happens more often? But the fact is I don't think that's the point. I mean, because like in the sense like for instance, Black Lives Matter, when Daniel Shaver died, they still protested for that. Matter of fact, white people did not protest for it, and a lot of them were actually saying back then, I remember the comments were like, oh, well, he probably deserved it, or he was a bad guy anyways, let's say like, oh, he probably did something. They'd rather trust the police over that. And so I think I mean, I was just saying that to address what I was saying earlier, as in they sometimes completely misunderstand the message of Black Lives Matter. But I think I think it's kind of I think that is true. That is something that we shouldn't be focusing on as much, and that's the argument which you often hear people, which is a fallacy. I forgot the exact name of the fallacy, but like this idea, like we can't focus on one because one somehow is more prevalent, or you say like, someone tries to bring up something, it's like, well, I don't think you should bring that up because it's not that serious. But that's true in a logical standpoint. But in a practical standpoint, when people have very strong emotions or certain experiences associated with something, sometimes you have to read the room, in the sense like, if people are going to talk about police brutality and how it intersects strictly with BIPOC like identities, and then you decide to bring in and say something which might kind of somehow be irrelevant to the conversation, then that has to do with reading the room and certain like tone things. Like, you don't want to bring up certain issues when someone's talking about another issue, because it's just not, it's sort of disrespectful, right? I mean, it'd be like if someone was talking about, hey, my kid just died of cancer last week, and then you suddenly say, oh shoot, but my kid this week, did you hear that she broke her, did you hear my daughter broke her leg? And then someone was grieving over their kid dying from cancer. That's the whole thing. It's like, yeah, there's a time and place for everything. I think that's the whole thing I want to bring up there. So yeah, we don't want to ignore those issues. There's a time and place for us to bring them up. And of course, we want to make space for that.
Go ahead, Mico.
I think there's also like the issue of like, remember when you guys talked about context and like how it matters within our like placement in the community? That has a lot to do with like how BIPOCs interact with the police more so than like white people. So like the system that policing in America was basically built to make certain people more comfortable, like the wealthy, to protect their property, and some could argue that like the system of policing also like benefited the white people the most because they were the ones who implemented that kind of system of policing while slavery was still there, and like how the system of policing actually took advantage of slavery. Modern prison systems kind of like mirror like the system of slavery in the past. So like that kind of like context is also important to understand like why BIPOC have worse experiences with the police.
Yeah, and bringing up the Daniel Shaver case again, I want to bring that up because that you can see the reaction was very different. See, white people came from the general white American community comes from this perspective of kind of like trusting the police. The police are here to protect us, and so this kind of idea is like, okay, well, if someone gets shot by the police, it's they think it's very likely that person did something bad or they did something that somehow deserved that. And so a lot of times people, they didn't even look into the case. They just saw, oh, it's another guy who shot, he probably did something bad. They didn't even look into the case and look into the videos, evidence showing, he's begging for his life and saying, please don't hurt me, don't hurt me. It was a very disturbing video if you haven't seen it, by the way. But then the Black community acted up against it because they're like, their perspective on policing is just widely different. Yeah, and you see that historically. I mean, to touch on what you're saying, Mico, more, it's like the police was often used to kind of quell the inner city populations, whoever those were, depending on the time period. I mean, today we often see BIPOC in the inner city, as well as certain, especially like Southeast Asian groups. And then at one point, back in the 1900s, it was the white ethnic immigrants. It's always whoever was in the inner city at that time is like, those were the people you wanted to watch out for because
I think like the inner cities like serve as like an in-group and out-group separation. Yep. That's probably why. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was gonna say that like I think that one thing that I personally find like frustrating is that typically from what I've seen for white people, and this is not a blanket statement to say all who have saying, but it's just in my experience, is that for white people an issue isn't an issue until it's an issue for them, and I find that extremely problematic because when you look, I think at like white people wanting to care about the movement, it takes a lot for them to like get involved. And now, as of like when we've seen the police brutalizing like people of all races, suddenly more white people are outraged by that. And don't get me wrong, I think I understand that like people need a personal investment in it, but I also feel like to some extent like Black people and like Latin Americans and Asian people have a better sense of community to where we kind of care about like people across the board. Like it's kind of like how when like how the Black Lives Matter movement is like, let's defund the police, but then like let's take the money and like invest it into services that'll benefit everyone. Like instead of Black people being like, let's get reparations for all Black people, instead their response was, let's just invest in the community so everyone has better opportunity. And I think that you can, again, like I said when I was talking about the civil rights movement, that the movements that Black people tend to make or spearhead aren't just movements for like us or for them. It's like for everyone. As to where when white people have like this All Lives Matter movement, All Lives Matter is just a counter protest to a protest. And they don't even do anything about like police brutality or the inequity of like white people in poor neighborhoods or in trailer parks or in slums, the disparity of like the number of veterans that are poor or like children in the border. They don't really do anything. So I think that it's like, this, again, identity politics with the term Black Lives Matter was just because the group that spearheaded it happened to be Black. But I mean, like, their actual motive is for all lives. I mean, the most eloquent wording of this that I have heard was that all lives matter, but Black lives matter too. I'm not saying, so the whole phrase is not just that Black lives matter, but rather that all lives matter and Black lives also matter is the whole point.
Yeah.
I think to like make your point more colorful, John, because I think to some of the white viewers, it might seem like, from my experience with engaging with white people, they might kind of like misunderstand your point to kind of be like a stab at them, right? But I think what's
I'm gonna be seen as that radical leftist real fast. I'm gonna be like, oh, the white tears, the white tears.
But like Christian, like I just don't want people to misunderstand because I know like John's point is mostly about like how white people have more of like a comfortability around society, which is why like they don't really feel the need to kind of like fight back. And I think that's because like we're not saying like white people like they're not like they're
no. Actually, I think hold your horses here. No. Actually, if you look at Black Lives Matter protests, there's a huge number of them. Actually, probably the majority in a lot of these recent protests actually have been white people.
No, that's what I've been trying to say. Like they make good allies and stuff, and like they do care. They make up a good amount of it, but like for the white people that aren't like participating in it, I'm just saying like it's because I think it's like the culture of like African Americans in America has been basically struggling, right? Like they've had more time, they've had more experiences with like these struggles, like they've had more encounters with like the police, things like that. Stuff like basically minorities have more encounters with systemic racism, systemic oppression than basically people who like have less experience or exposure to them, which is usually like white people or males, things like that. So that's why like in terms of explaining why their participation for some people might be less than I guess the group that's spearheading it, like African Americans, is based on like this bubble that some of them are like in.
Well, I think another way to see it is from the idea that basically there has to do with a sense. I think it actually you can relate this back to the idea of individualism versus like coming together and kind of seeing yourself from a more identity perspective and kind of I mean, it's the reason why, for instance, like whenever they're say an Asian character on TV, they always associate them so much with their Asianness. But if the white character is seen as quote unquote normal, it's the racialization I think is an important thing to consider here. So people I think are more likely to actually see things from that perspective if they've actually faced racialization and racism, and which kind of puts them with a group other people in that group. But the thing is since white people don't really face that as much, at least for their race, they don't. They're not going to. They're much less likely to be able to actually identify or like understand like how these identities are affecting these people and take it as seriously. I think that's the whole thing. It's like if you've experienced racialization, you would understand the idea of coming together in solidarity with other people.
Ironically, the All Lives Matter people who would think that they're being attacked by Black Lives Matter are experiencing some form of racialization, aren't they?
Yeah, so it's like a very quick reaction because they're not used to it. I think that's a big part of it. And
well, that's also the perception. I wouldn't say that like Black Lives Matter, I would think at best is more addressing the negatives with a positive, like, hey, let's do something for Black people in regards to police violence, but for some reason it's observed as it ought to be detrimental. Like if someone is going to be helped, that means I ought to be helped less, or I'm gonna have to lose something for someone else's gain.
Yeah, that's also true too.
Is there another slide, Mico?
Yeah, there is. I just realized we never like kind of explained what identity politics is, and I feel like some people might be confused who don't know what identity politics is.
The first
That's
one.
I don't really feel like we need to explain. I don't feel like we'll need to explain the terms anyways, because like identity, like this stuff exists on the internet. Like people can Google it. Identity politics is like
Google is free.
Yeah, Google is free.
I was joking. I said it sarcastically.
But even if we were to define what identity politics is, everyone will probably have their own definition of what that means, and that could also be the issue or the root of what we want to get at. Is, you know, if we bring someone else onto this, they probably won't disagree. Like, what would identity politics mean amongst other people? But you know, this is the first one.
I think in the most general terms, I would define it as basically where people of particular identity, say religion, nationality, race, gender, kind of, or like multiple of these, of course, too. Wait, what? Not necessarily a political party, but they come together to form like common interests, which serve such people from that identity. I think that's the best way to say it. I mean, yeah, you're right. It doesn't have to necessarily be political, like strictly political, as in involved with government or political parties, but just come together to serve general socio-political interests for that group.
Well, I was gonna say, I think it definitely can have to do with people who are from like a certain like political group, is what I was saying.
Oh, that's what you're saying. Yeah, that's true too.
Because like I find like people typically who are left or right, they'll oftentimes be like, well, I'm a Republican or a Democrat, and like their identity. Just so everybody knows that being Republican or Democrat is not a personality. Just letting you know, it's not.
Being Californian is, though.
I think that's our next slide.
California is a personality. That is.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to bring up one last thing before we moved on about identity politics. I think one other detrimental effect of it, sometimes if we think too much in these terms, you can get caught up in saying like, invalidating someone's identity or saying somehow like you're not really blank just because you don't think the way the majority of the people in your group think, or you don't match sort of what a perceived way a group should think.
You're not
I-
you don't vote for me.
yeah, like but Biden said, you know, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. So I mean, there's or and that wasn't an exact quote, but something like that, right?
I think that
So
might
I mean,
as well be exact.
That might as well have been it. Honestly, I'm sure Biden can't even remember, so you're fine.
I thought he was joking.
yeah, but like that does. But I'm not. He probably was joking. In a way.
I
It's sort of a
feel
tongue-in-cheek
like it's
comment,
something that someone said to him offhandedly. Maybe even someone who was black who said, "Oh yeah, you gotta vote for you, guys. I'm not sure they're black." He's, "Hey, that's a good idea. I should repeat that."
Joe Biden is like that one like kid in your class is like, oh, I can say the N word. I have a black friend. And
Oh my gosh.
You're gonna get so much. You're gonna get so much hate from reviewers. Oh my gosh.
I'm ready. I'm so ready. Honestly, at me in the comments.
I mean, sure. I think Biden in some ways is really not left at all.
Let's
right?
save the Biden episode for next week.
Yeah.
Then.
Sorry. So yeah, with the identity politics thing, that I just think that's like people can like flock to it and then they like strongly identify with being like Democrat or Republican, but it's not a personality, people.
No, it shouldn't be. There's a joke. Yeah, your identity shouldn't necessarily be your personality. I mean, that's your individual experiences and how these identities come together in a unique way. I mean, like, I've heard people say that, like, being mixed race is not a personality trait. I've even heard people say more controversially, being LGBTQ plus is not a personality trait. But you know, I'm not making any claims for those. I'm just saying that's what people have said.
That's just what people have said.
There's
Right.
there's
This is where our disclaimer helps because a lot of these are not our opinions.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
one bit, like on Big Mouth where this older guy was like, being young, mean, and gay isn't a personality. But
I will remove the disclaimer though. I do think being mixed race is not a personality trait. And that's specifically towards all those TikTokers who do the Asian check shit that's really cringy. I'm sorry. Like, and I don't know why, but they all look the same too. Like, I know a lot of mixed people can look very different, even if they're from the same background, right? Of course, they can look extremely different. You can't make, but like for some reason, all the Asian heyo TikTokers all look the same. I don't know why. Like, I'm just saying this as someone who's also a quote unquote Asian.
You passed the
I don't
Asian
understand.
check.
Yeah, and
Christian, are you mixed? We haven't talked about this.
Well, I'm Mexican, so I mean, according to 23andMe, I'm mixed, but that's the entire population of Mexico, right?
Oh yeah, okay.
just so everybody knows, Mexicans are also not here for racism.
So I guess Jonas and John are like the only ones that are mixed then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like half indigenous.
Hey! Let's not gatekeep mixed people. Christian, if you want to see themselves mixed, that's fine. Hey, because I mean, to be fair, no, in perspective. For instance, like I mean, as an example, like I know a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know, I'm not sure which word, Latino or Latinx, because I've heard very different interpretations of that, and people on both sides who argued for one or the other. So I'll just say, to be safe, I'll say Latinx. But there's definitely a lot of Latinx people I know who have tried to take up some degree of like a mixed identity, at least from a racial perspective. And I also know a lot of Filipinos who do the same, especially the ones who have like a lot of Spanish.
For me, especially growing up, I'd have to answer all the question because my name is Christian Ernesto Nunez, so it sounds very like Mexican. Or my entire like upbringing is Mexican, but then people tell me, but you're white. It's like, yeah, I mean, we don't have education like what's passing or whatever, or is this binary from that sort of perspective. So it's hard to, there's this perception that all Mexicans are just brown. And
yeah.
There's also like understanding between Mexicans that there's people who are more indigenous than they are white, and there's people who are sort of in that mixed range. This is an entire different realm of like racial politics. I mean, particularly in like Hispaniola, New Spain, everything in down from Central to South America. There's lots of there's a big history of how racial politics played out, even between like black people and between like how much indigenous you were compared to how white you were, and then if you were black at all. And it's weird. At this point, for me, it becomes so convoluted. I just kind of don't want to care about it so much. Like I have to play like, oh, well, some guys say like I'm just these things. Oh, here's this. I like to say that I'm Mexican because that's really what I am. Well, in a way, I'm Californian because I'm like of this region. But then if I say that, people are like, "Oh, you want to pretend you're not Mexican?" So like I feel like there's no good answer. So it has become something that's too convoluted for me to want to talk about at all.
I was gonna say like, this is like where identity politics becomes like very confusing and more skewed. The idea that like you can be from a place and then not be of like the majority race for that place. Like, I think you're right. I think Americans in a lot of the world are like, oh, Mexicans are brown, but it's like there are black Mexicans, there are white Mexicans, hell, there are even Asian Mexicans.
There's lots
So
of
like,
yeah.
the country doesn't mean color. Country just means like the borders of where you're
Yeah,
from.
but I mean, even if we're talking about the kids who are being taken on the border, like a lot of them aren't necessarily brown. Not that that should be a qualification how they should be treated, but if you like, they don't look that different. I mean, particularly in like how racialized everything is. Like you could put that kid in a classroom, no one's gonna think any different. But as soon as he starts speaking Spanish, now it's an issue that some people become insecure about. But as far as deciphering these type of things, it's sort of just a very clunky thing to deal with, I think.
I think that's why people make the argument that the like administration of ICE is more racist rather than individual ICE agents, because there's a perception, I think, amongst ICE that like Latin Americans or or that are here, or illegal immigrants that are here, to be more specific.
And that's a good segue into the next slide, which I actually saw, which says systemic approach. That's a very broad description, Mico.
Charter.
This is meant to be a very broad discussion.
I mean, as far as like systemic, I mean, it's been recently discussed about how systems can be systemically racist or systemically oppressive. So like you could fill like the police department with any amount of people. I mean, for example, I may be wrong in this description, but that the system in of itself, the way that it's constructed, is in of itself something that's built to be a racist thing. And I think that while I don't think I know enough about police systems to properly elucidate, and I'm not going to say I agree or disagree, but particularly I think ICE is something that is a easy example of something that is built on a systemically oppression, in a nature of systemic oppression. To think about it being founded, I believe, after 9/11, to find people who shouldn't be there, to hunt down illegal immigrants who are particularly Arab, of course with like all the Islamophobia that followed. But then lately it's become something that's been primarily fixated on Hispanics. So the system in of itself is built to hunt down people who aren't, fitting the background. Like if you can be picked out amongst other people, the more different you are, the more of a target you ought to be for ICE. And I thought it was very interesting that David Dobrik, I mean, I personally don't follow David Dobrik, but I know a lot of people who love David Dobrik. Like he's like, what was that?
He was DACA, right? Like
he's on DACA. He's like, here's this white kid who fits into the DACA thing, and there's all these people who have all these arguments. Like, it's like now David Dobrik's gonna leave, and like David Dobrik is a good example of the type of people of the like the worst case of person you disagree with. I don't want to get too much into discussing immigration because that's an entirely broad topic that I don't want. We can say at the front of the episode. But like he makes a lot of money. He has a nice house. He buys like all this random stuff. He puts that back into his local economy. And like based on this law, I mean supposedly these Republicans who want to make sure that we keep paying for all these things. Now this guy, we should get him out of here. He probably employs people. Those people definitely pay taxes. This guy probably wants to pay his taxes. But we've put up a system that keeps this guy from paying into the American system, and we're like, oh, I don't want them here because they don't pay taxes, but I also don't want to have a system that lets them pay the taxes in the first place. My dog is snoring.
Yeah, I think a personal experiences versus. So I think one thing I just wanted to note something, which is I think a lot of people when they talk about system, I think they talk about it like it's some untangible like reality or some kind of weird like thing which you can't really understand. It's very abstract. System, systemic. I think one way to easily understand, which I think this is something which people often forget, is kind of how personal experiences and biases are actualized when a lot of people with those same ideas or similar ones are in positions of power, and then you see the net effect of this. A good example would be how a lot of studies have shown that people who have especially white names, especially like Anglo names, they tend to be more likely hired for jobs.
Oh, I read
And
that too.
this is an example. Wait, what were you saying?
I read that study too for one of
Well,
my.
it was like it's freakonomics and stuff. It was in a lot of things, right? But the point is like this is an example, I think, of systemic oppression, which comes from the actions of multiple individuals who share similar biases and ideas, and we see the net effect. Of course, there's individuals who might not have those biases. I'm sure there's plenty of them out there. Well, I mean, there certainly are many of them out there. But the point is that if the majority of people think a certain way, you'll see that net effect. And I think that's one example of systemic oppression. And so I think we often do forget. Sometimes people say things like, oh, individual stuff that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what individuals think. It should be focusing more on the systemic side of things. But you can't forget sometimes that the systemic side is very frequently made, and this is debated, right? Debatable. I've heard people say varying things on how much of it is individuals and how much of it is just laws and things being baked in to support certain forms of oppression. But I mean, I've heard some who would argue and say most of the systemic oppression actually is, in fact, collective biases of multiple people all acting to keep some sort of oppressive thing there. At least, and maybe you can see more of this in the direction of things. But the point is, though, is that people often they ignore the individual side of things or they say it's not important, but it is very important in the sense that when you see multiple individuals with a similar idea, this is actualized systemically.
Right, and I think like an example of like systemic oppression would be like policies like the government enacts, right? So we can see a lot of this happen when it comes to stuff like welfare, or when it comes to stuff like prison systems where they like try to make a profit off of like minorities and minor crimes. Um, so yeah, the system was basically built by people who have the power and the ability to exploit like certain aspects of a person. It might have to do with like social status, class, or it has to do with like race, or it has to do with gender. Just generally like those who have been minorities for like the longest time, and like context here is also really important because we always like talk about context and how it's important right now, but also context in the past historically is also important because that kind of affects like how the transition is and like how certain things like you can see patterns between like the past and like modern day and how it's showcased in different ways, but it's still there. It might be less explicit, but it's also more harmful because it's implicit and it seems like it's not that impactful, but yet it still is.
Well, it'd also be considered systemic if it's, I believe, though, the Marxist connotation is that if it has incentivizations. That's why capitalism is this thing that's racist in of itself. But I mean, if you take away private prison systems, if you make laws rent all these things, I mean, I don't want to segue into a discussion about capitalism if that's like off topic, but like how much can you prevent legal systems to protect those virtues and not allow things to be not allow the ability to profit off of things like human suffering or their free labor, like in prisons.
Right.
I think the biggest issue I've had as of late actually addressing the issue of like personal experience versus systemic oppression is the fact that like a lot of people, typically the people that I've talked to who seem to be more on the right side of things, to clarify the right wing, not the actual right side of things, they tend to have this perception where they're like, well, show me where in the law that it's racist. Show me in the law where it's misogynistic. Show me this specific word where people are being discriminated against based on sex, gender, religion, whatever you want to call it. And the issue with this is that when you look at like the word of the law, but not the context in which it's used, nor the applications of that law, then you're setting a dangerous precedent for the fact that America is free simply because it doesn't contain any discrimination in its wording. To be clear, that when the Constitution was drafted, it gave what rights, liberty, and freedom to all people, is what it says, but yet was used and applied in such a way that women and people of color didn't have rights. So it's important not to look just at like what laws say or whether or not systemic oppression is racist just by what it says, but actually how the law is being applied. So when you guys were saying things about like, talking about ICE or talking about prison systems and things like that, it's important to look at that, even though they're not saying they're directly going after, Latin Americans, or they're specifically going to go after Black people or, people of color. The fact of the matter is the systems put in place are to go after those groups of people, and that's why they're being used, even if the legislation doesn't say so. And the biggest thing is that it's actually not even illegal, that until something's actually declared to be illegal, it's not a problem. Until there's legislation protecting against it or specifically detailing protection, laws can be applied in any way that they want to be applied. You could claim anything, which is why, going back to the issue with ICE, that even though a lot of the people in there, are Latin Americans of various ethnicities and skin tones and colors, that the actual idea of ICE is to go after people that are Latin American in a way that's racist. But even though ICE doesn't go after people who tend to be, like maybe from Europe and their visas expire, or from Asia and their visa expires, they don't go after them. It's almost always specifically Latin Americans. If that made sense.
I would personally attest to that. Like, I had friends that worry about ICE stopping by their doors just because they're from Latin America. And honestly, my parents do kind of worry about that, but I feel like it's less so for us because, well, yeah, because like generally like they do tend to target like minorities from the border, and like there's obviously records and like patterns that you can see that's already reported by people who are working at the borders right now, who are trying to get people out. And a lot of the news you see about like those who are being detained are also just generally people who are of Latin American descent, especially like kids right now. So.
Yeah, so that's the thing though, is like they say things. I mean, you can already question like an agency like this existing in the first place, but let's assume that we take some political perspective, which is more rightist, and says, okay, like basically like we can't have unrestricted immigration. Like they say that and say, okay, we're going to deport people, and that's what they think is the solution. So let's just assume that, right? But they still target primarily Latin American people. I mean, because even though they say, okay, we're going to deport everyone, say equally, they don't do that. I mean, you see in the numbers, it's very clear that they target Latin Americans. I mean, of course, there's people I've seen deported. Like, for instance, there was that case about what was that, like a year ago or something, where they set up a fake college in the middle of like, was it like somewhere in the southeastern United States, and they set up a fake college, right? And basically something about you didn't have to be like a citizen or something, and then they like deported a bunch of people. Almost every single person they deported was actually Indian from that case. Actually, they weren't. But the fact is that still happens at so much of a less level than it does to Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, and there was also cases like, yeah, there's even people being deported to Ireland, for instance. Like I heard a few cases like that, or other places in Europe. But it happens at such a fewer scale than it happens to Latin America.
Our turning of people's lives is intersectional. We got Asian peoples, we got Indians, we got Irish people.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, and that goes back to what John was saying, was like, yeah, the laws can maybe make things seem, I guess that was a bad example because that's a law which, I mean, I personally would question even having that in the first place. I mean, of course, but I think that that still brings us to the point, like there's the idea of, are things, you can't have equality without equity, and I think that's something that Chris and I were talking about. That depends how you define equality, because some people say equality literally just means everything's applied the same to everyone. In that case, that doesn't address certain biases that people were having, as I was saying earlier. Like certain individual biases come out even in cases where things are quote unquote applied equally, right? Or but then there's the idea of equity, which is like, are you addressing these, like, what we should say, like context, right? That's really what it goes down to when we talk about equity. Of course, some would define equality as literally just applying everything the same, but I mean, I would argue that you can't have equality without equity. So true equality wouldn't actually be just applying everything equally, be applying everything within context and applying everything, keeping in mind sort of the disadvantages certain groups have had in the past, and also the idea that certain like that in our society that people still don't apply things equally on a de facto scale. Or de facto, they don't apply things equally.
I think that's like the difference between equality nowadays versus like equality in the past. Because right now we're more cognizant of like the concept of equity, whereas in the past, because it was super unequal, where like certain like groups of people were barred from even like the most basic rights of voting or kind of like owning property. Equality has been set to such a low bar in the past, but now like since we've overcome like that hurdle for some minority groups, it becomes more blurred as to like, are we fighting for equality or not? Because some people don't really understand that equality also has to do with equity, and they just think that, oh, once we already have equality, like you're done, right? Like that's why people have such a difficult time grasping why gender issues still exist, or like why racial issues still exist, because they think like the biggest issues that those minorities face are already like done, and so like they already like gay people, they already got their marriage, right? Like what else do they want? Kind of that kind of mindset.
For me, don't tread on me. Honestly.
Now we can start talking about like politics.
The three genders.
Three genders, are you referring to left, center, right, or liberals, conservatives, libertarians?
I mean, according to the slides, that's what we got.
I think it's better to think of liberals, libertarians, and conservatives as sort of the... Well, those aren't the only.
Well,
those
there's
can't be
also
the
leftists who consider being called liberals bad.
They're honestly the biggest groups in America right now.
They are the big... Well, I feel like among the youth, there's a growing number of leftists. Definitely see that. Yeah. Libertarians
even ideologically, like someone who's down for like, I feel like, but that's the corner that college puts you into, particularly being very liberal but becoming left-leaning in their discussions, is that if you like capitalism but you like rights, you kind of lean into calling yourself a libertarian. And I fell into this until I noticed, well, I like some regulation, and I realized, oh wait, I'm not actually libertarian. I'm just a Democrat. And all these people who think that Democrats are as left as they are, who think Nancy Pelosi is a Republican, they're actually not. they're down to move the party. The Democratic Party's the big tent party, as they like to say, but they're not mainstream at all. Like this is why AOC had to get smacked down by Nancy Pelosi to stop causing trouble, because she needs to get things done.
No, I'm going to give a sort of take, which I don't know if a lot of you are going to agree on, but I think the left, center, right thing really is contextual in terms of what you consider center. It kind of goes around what you consider center. I mean, like some will say, for instance, you could argue that compared to, say, Western Europe, the United States, the center for them would be considered pretty right in Western Europe. Yeah. But it makes you beg it sort of like brings up the question, is there a universal standard, we should say, for center? Because according to some people like Bernie say are center, and say Joe Biden is very right, and basically the whole Democratic Party is very right. And I've heard people say,
I think one of the problems the U.S. has right now is like too much of a focus on this kind of grouping.
Yeah.
I see that like becoming more and more prevalent, because like whenever we talk about issues like this issue, the issue of wearing masks has become partisan for some reason.
Well, it's the identity politics, as John was saying. It's the identity. They might not fully agree, but they're going to stick with that identity because that's what their party and people who identify as conservative are with, or people who identify as liberal are going.
This is what I'm trying to avoid whenever I have conversations with people, even if they noticeably have like a more conservative leaning or like a liberal leaning perspective. Like I try to avoid trying to like point it out that it's a liberal perspective or it's a conservative perspective.
Yeah.
Like I try to redirect it to the actual issues at hand, which is more important, because like when you're trying to fight for rights, or when you're trying to convince someone that these issues, being like an activist, like these issues are more important than identity, like I think it's important to stay away from like those kind of labels, right? Yeah, the labels of like conservative or liberal, because I think those are actually really toxic right now.
Especially labeling someone else as those. Yeah, you don't. That's a general rule of thumb, I think, which is something you should follow, is don't force identities upon other people, but at the same time allow them to realize perhaps their position in the scheme of things. So allow them to discover, because then they can think of it through their experiences, but then kind of also think of it more critically too, right? It's like, I'm not just going to take my experiences for granted, but at the same time I'll kind of be sort of guided by my place in things, or sort of in a way, because like, yeah, you don't want to tell people what you think they should think. I mean, I think that's a really toxic thing, telling them, oh, well, if you identify as this, you must think this, or if you are thinking, that goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? You don't also, on the other side, you don't want to say, okay, because you're part of this identity, if you don't think this way, you're not really part of that identity. So I think, yeah, important stuff to consider, I think.
Yeah, I think also, like, when it comes to political identity, stuff like that, it differs on, like, a huge amount of issues. So, like on the right, I listed a couple of issues that I thought are pretty big right now. I kind of forgot climate change, but, you know, it's there. But people tend to have, even though they would fall under like a label personally, they tend to have differing opinions on those issues. So one of the issues that they might consider to be more left might be like gender and race, but like another issue that they might consider to be more right might be immigration and things like that. And so I think it's like more important to tackle like one issue at a time when you're talking to someone who's of like a different perspective.
I think that's just rooted in how dumb our political discourse in America is, because I think the breadth of our understanding, unless you took like a government class, I mean even then if you took a government class, is that communism bad, capitalism good, and who knows, that I would probably I agree with that, but the reasoning in of itself, I wouldn't. That's not enough. It's just good or bad. Just our culture appraises it that way. You know, I want a small government, but I also want armed police officers. Like, it just lots of built-in contradictions to help you understand how these things ought to work. More government is always bad. Less government is always good. But it's even leaning into like a conservative realm, which obviously, I mean, particularly as Californians, think we sort of push back on that more. But necessarily, I think that's still sort of a root of like American culture that doesn't want to necessarily deal with, you know, bureaucracy. Like, we're sort of inherent. We have a culture that's built against sort of power structures. Like, we fought the monarchy that was also kind of a parliament.
Distrust of government and distrust of control from the government and like intervention,
which is ironic. Because then like these same people who need to arm themselves, who support the NRA, because I need my guns to protect myself from the evil government, well, they also advocate for police officers having more power. So but even in the realm of, you know, like a liberal society, like when it comes to people who would call themselves communists, like actual leftists, like what being liberal is becomes very different. What that sort of center
an insult
is.
Again, an insult for different reasons.
Yeah, but it's an insult for different reasons, because it's advocating for things that they don't prefer. But then it's even not necessarily tied into my observation of like the left being sided with identity politics. That's sort of an opposition to a status quo, and that's a sort of side they all take. So when people want to criticize how things are, you're just going to happen to be on the same side. And if you're like things how they are, there's some things you have to agree with. But I think this also is an issue of the binary of our political system, of how it is with the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, I've heard solutions like ranked choice voting can open things up. You know, the power of like two parties creating this opposition and government force. But even that notion of opposition government force is the nature of a parliamentary system that is more popular in like Europe. Like there still needs to be oppositions and governments. That's often a criticism of just like throwing in one party is going to somehow change everything. When we've obviously had like elections for presidents that were skewed because, you know, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be a bull moose Republican, and now these sort of programs don't work. But that's also an understanding of like these are systems, like whether it's like capitalism, whether it's communism, whether it's our current constitution or any amendments we add to it, that these for the most part are tools. But for America, these things are actually like part of our culture because we perhaps lack so much in that context. That's the whole reason why we have like square dancing. Like that's our dance. But who square dances anymore? Like this is hardly a practical vestige of our actual popular culture if we look at how we behave. So I think the conservative sort of perspective or how we look at politics is really just an opposition versus the way things are. And that's how we get that's how like Marxism gets rolled up into, you know, like LGBT rights. Like, and I always try to get this answer, like, how is Marxism intrinsically pro-LGBT? And then everyone can make up many reasons, and other people can make up reasons as to, but, like, the right isn't going to want to make those arguments as to how, or I should say the Republicans in the United States aren't going to make the argument as to what's intrinsically positive between LGBT things and capitalism. Yeah.
I feel like it's only wait, we're done. Can you?
Oh well.
Everybody wants.
You're about to. You were talking.
Oh.
Go. I have like a long spiel, so you can go first.
I'm chilling. That's what I say. Is John there? I feel like John left. Hello, John.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, just chilling.
Jonas is frozen?
Who?
Oh, I feel like Jonas was frozen for a minute.
No.
Frozen.
I was waiting to see who was talking. If John was going to talk, if John wasn't going to talk, I was going to talk. But if he's going to talk, I was going to let him.
We should have a conch. Like here's the conch. We'll pass it around.
The conch.
Magic conch. The magic conch.
I haven't read that.
Magic conch. Should we continue talking? Yes.
I mean, it's we're almost at an hour 30 minutes.
Okay,
Right.
we can cut it down.
We'll cut it down. It's fine. So what I was saying, I think the reason why we can see it from Marx's perspective here, there's one you can think of it. I think a lot of history can be broken down easily into a group that wants change, a group that doesn't want change. I mean, I think it's a classic example. Another one is the oppressors versus the oppressed. Which side you want to be on? You want to be on the side of the people who are, and generally, I mean, of course, in an American perspective, we usually want to side on the oppressed class in a way, and that has to do with the history of the United States. I mean, in the sense that they saw themselves as sort of the "don't tread on me" thing comes from that, right? It's like they don't want the British, they don't want the British like king and like, you know, like stepping on the American colonies, you know, and stepping on their rights. So I think though, but don't forget that in a lot of other parts in the world, they think from more so Darwinist perspective. You know, it's like the strong shall rule, the strong shall conquer. The groups that are more dominant, we should follow them because they are the ones who set the example. They're the ones who rule. They're the ones we should respect their power. And that we forget that perspective is still very dominant in a lot of parts of the world. The strong rule, the strong will be on top. And so, yeah, you could also think of it as a perspective as are going to side more with the oppressed class, the ones who need to be liberated, the ones who need to be revolt against the upper classes, or do we want to be on the side of the people who are ruling? You know, you want to quote unquote bootlick, which is what, you know, a lot of leftists say, the term bootlicking. Do you want to lick their boots? Yeah, and I mean, honestly, it's I mean my dad comes from a country and from a part of the world where, yeah, they tend to be a lot more sometimes in the social Darwinist perspective, and that's why they're so nationalistic, because they're like, you know, I'm going to fight for I'm going to fight for my nation and my people because we want to come out on top. And I think that often does arise in cases where there's a lot of different ethnic groups in conflict, because then they get so desperate for power and autonomy because they're all so like have little power, they just end up fighting, and that's why they so much take part in that. You also find social Darwinism might be more common in areas that are ruled by some larger empire or larger group. I'd be honest. I mean, I think it's clear that in historically in East Asia there has been sort of, and today there's still some elements, vestigial elements of social Darwinism in favor of, say, Han Chinese and like Sinic and Chinese civilization sort of being the center. And I think in a lot of hidden, I think in the background of a lot of East Asian countries, even the non-Chinese ones, it's sort of the idea that Chinese civilization is the core, it's the dominant power culture we should look up to. We should look to Confucianism. We should look up to military as Sun Tzu would have wanted. I mean, that's starting to disintegrate, right? But there's remnants of that. So, and someone might even argue that historically that was the dominant perspective. You know, social Darwinism. You know, the Age of Empires. Yeah, that was the dominant philosophy. Whatever group was the strongest came out on top. I think actually, if you look historically, this idea of this left, we call like train of thought, you know, or the thought, you know, we should be supporting the press should be respecting the struggles and we should be trying to give them a rights, is I think a relatively recent idea. At least as a dominant idea, it's less recent. I mean, of course, maybe in the past, well, even in the past, you could say that the oppressed classes were even thinking in that perspective, in the sense like in a lot of these empires, a lot of it went unchallenged because there was the classes were kind of like, all right, well, the empire gives us our needs to continue, even if our culture isn't well represented or language is sort of secondary or even lower.
I think the idea of like social Darwinism and just Darwinism period, and kind of like that one group has to like be downtrodden for another group to succeed, was always based on like you can root it back to like as old as humanity, even life itself, right? That like the strong survive and the weak like just fizzle out. And by that process, society and the world becomes stronger, right? That it's better. Traditionally, it's always been better for humanity when the weak are destroyed and beaten and the physically strong and the smarter succeed. It's always been to the benefit of humanity when that happens. Up until recently, then nowadays, you know, we don't have to compete over things like, you know, food and resources like that. And I'm not saying just even in America, I'm talking about in the world, this concept of lack is largely indicative of what's the word? Like an ancient relic form of like society. Like capitalism is strongly rooted in this idea that there's not enough. And so for me to get a bigger piece of the pie, you have to get less. Yeah. And that's just not true anymore, especially when you look at like, for example, like capitalism with no capital, like programs and things that are written that don't actually have any like hard capital value. Yeah. It's just a value that people are willing to pay for items. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the overarching idea of the fact that humanity benefits itself through like Darwinism and social Darwinism is, in my opinion, superseded by the idea that every human brings something to the table, something to offer, and that society, it actually behooves us to then give people access to resources so that then they can provide more services for humanity. Like, for example, if you have 50 researchers working on a cure for cancer versus say like 500 researchers, right? Or people trying to get into space, or colonizing the moon, or working on beating greenhouse gases. The more people you have that are educated, the more likely you are to come to some kind of conclusion or breakthrough concept or idea that can solve humanity's problems. Yeah. So I think that people on the right sometimes still are in this deep idea that capitalism is a cure-all because historically it's been extremely useful. But nowadays, for humanity as it moves forward, that we don't have to compete for everything. That more social equity, or even like more system that moves closer to socialism, is more beneficial. I think, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think another argument I hear people on the right say is kind of like it's human nature for people to want to be individuals that can fight for their own rights, either for their group or their own rights for like the majority. So in their sense is basically saying there's a natural hierarchy of things that we should respect because that's the animal kingdom. And animal kingdom, groups die out, and groups to supersede, groups are dominant. So they think that somehow that if we don't respect that, then it goes against human nature and it goes against human being.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of like this like old relic ideology and just like holding on to what's been instead of pushing forward to what could be, I think. In my opinion.
That's a good place to leave it. Maybe a hint for what the next episode can be. Maybe capitalism and socialism.
That's too specific, isn't it? I feel like we should maybe go into something more general.
Real quick.
But yeah, well, we can discuss it later. But I think that I think that this whole time that we've been discussing everything, that I think that like what I found most valuable from discussing this with everybody was that like I don't think it has to be like one group versus another mentality. I think a better option really is to just discuss like the fact of like what the issue is and then how we can solve. Like I don't think socialism is a perfect cure for like everything going on in the world, but I do think that there's aspects of different ideologies that we could take and use that'll be beneficial in solving issues. Same thing with both the left and the right and the center. I don't think any one of them houses like or has a monopoly on what's yeah, exactly, on what's like what's the word for on what's ethical. But I think that each one of them has different aspects of like their ideologies and beliefs that better suit humanity. It's just about like that's why I don't like identity politics. I think it's too broad and too vague.
I think what's important though, like another point to like not liking identity politics and like not liking to kind of take one side, is that if you start talking to people on the other side, you'll find out you actually have a lot more in common with them.
Yeah.
Than you actually think. So like a lot of people who I've spoken to in regards to either like Black Lives Matter or like immigration, I think one of the biggest things that we don't really see eye to eye on is just economy, but everything else is kind of generally we're on the same page, but they just have different ways or methods of like approaching it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people tend to be very favorable for like police reform, whether it's like right or the left. It just like depends on like how some people might approach it. And the left seems to like want to take more like of the radical approach, while the right believes in like gradual change, things like that. Or like in terms of immigration,
the right just wants everything to be the same, or like if they're libertarians, they just want no bars.
It depends on the right. I mean, the more further right, they might say it doesn't.
It depends on the policymaker, I guess. But I mean, typically with the right, I feel like they have most of what they want, and that's why they're the conservatives who want to maintain the status quo.
I don't think that's very true. I think they're like you're kind of generalizing too much. I think there's people who do agree and there's people who don't. Like
wait, no, but that's what he's saying. I think he was saying you were generalizing by saying that they all think that they should have gradual change.
I said most.
Oh well, I mean, I think he was just emphasizing.
I think whatever the pace, whether gradual or not at all, has historically been too slow. I mean, it's not like this whole issue of like people of color being oppressed just started like 80 years ago or something. This is almost 400 years in the making. I think it's not radical to want equality. I just think that the fact that some people are going to be uncomfortable with it, and the key word there is uncomfortable, not even in pain, just uncomfortable, is the only issue, really. That white people are just going to be uncomfortable with change, but it doesn't mean they're in any danger from the change. So, I mean, again, like, when we say that, like, the left is radical for wanting this kind of change, I think radical implies that somehow that there's like a detrimental aspect to it. I think a better term is that it's just a little bit more like of a sharp turn.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think technically, if you look at it objectively, though, it is radical in the sense that the status quo so much favors, like, continuing the system, continuing the status quo, that it seems radical in the sense that it changes, but it's not a negative. I mean, I'm sorry, now this is me just trying to redefine the connotation of radical.
No, John,
but if you remove
John
the negative
laughed
connotation,
he read my message.
I'm sorry, no, I wasn't laughing at you. I deeply apologize. Yeah, I wasn't laughing at you. I was giggling at Christian, at something Christian said.
I'll check and see what that is. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just saying, I don't think radical needs to be a bad thing. I mean, radical just means that compared to the status quo, it's something different. But that doesn't even mean bad, because the status quo could be really bad.
I don't.
And it is
necessarily bad either. And also in terms of like the other, gender and race, I don't know, like might be a little bit more different. But I think like immigration, from most people who I've talked to who are more right leaning or like libertarians, they seem to be more favorable for like compromise, is how I think. So like closing the borders right now, but then like also allowing people who have been here to stay here, and have like a easier way to kind of get visas or like I guess citizenship. I think that's like what they kind of want generally.
Immigration is too complex for us to get into right now. It's way
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
I'm just
I was
giving
about
an
to say some stuff.
example.
Which
I'm just
was,
giving an example of like how like a lot of like our beliefs with like the right or the left kind of intersect, you know. Like so I'm
I
just
do
saying.
agree with that. Yeah, I don't think it's such a. I think on a lot of the issues are not so clear cut, but the groupings of left, right, and center try to make it clear cut.
yeah, it's not.
Like that's the problem I have with identity politics. I just feel that so many issues are more complex than just a label like, well, I'm a leftist liberal or I'm a right wing conservative. It's like it's really nuanced. Like you really have to talk to someone and get to know their ideology to then have a discussion rather than them just giving you a blanket statement.
Right.
Yeah, maybe a more accurate way to say is they're more left or more right on certain things, depending on what it is. Because, example, climate change. Let's be honest. I think a lot of right and left people agree that you need to make reform for climate change. Now, what happens is you often get there's also people on the right, though. This is not on the left. I think, as far as I know, I don't hardly any leftists who say this who think climate change isn't real, right? But there's a lot of conservatives who do think climate change is real. They do think it's a big. Matter of fact, a lot of them do even agree that it is majority caused by human activity. A lot of them might even say that. But the difference I found is often the perception of it. Now, people on the left think we have a duty as a nation which has had a lot of past issues with pollution and has contributed a lot to the pollution we have today to really like make things less, right? But then there's be better to the environment. But there's people on the right who say, I've heard one thing is we shouldn't do it because because if we do it, we're going to fall behind other countries because we're going to be sacrificing our industrial power and technology in favor of trying to help the environment. But then and then a lot of them also say something along the lines of, why should we decrease our thing if India and China over there are polluting more? And so then you have
all pollution matters.
I mean, okay, I'm not going to bring in my perspective because then that's going to open in a whole nother topic regarding the environment thing.
It sounds sounds like we should like start wrapping it up.
We'll use it for discussions in the future.
We'll definitely have some time to discuss those.
Yeah.
But thanks everyone for coming on today, though.
Yeah, everyone who's here. There's probably more hosts than there are viewers, but hopefully that changes. We get to start somewhere.
Next time we do this, we just need to plan out like the date and time a little more in advance, and then like we can post on our social medias like a week in advance and like giving people a date and time and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Posting the promotion.
Anywho, bye everyone who's on this call, and we'll retreat to a host meeting about how we'll let you know better how to hear us talk about things, and hopefully if you want to tell us why we're wrong, that'll also be good content. So feel free to tell us what we're wrong later in the comments, or if you want to.
We'll address them.
Huh?
We'll definitely.
Yeah. Everyone who answers, but.
It says 30 people reached 5 engagements, but those 5 might have literally just been us 4 plus one other person or something.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll figure it all out later. We shouldn't be doing it on here, but we'll talk about it in the chat.
I don't know how to end, so I'm just gonna end the stream.